Welcome to episode 115 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/115. Before I jump into this episode, I have an ask for you guys. A couple times a year, I take on clients. Client work is the core of my business, and it's how I spend the majority of my time. And after working with clients for the last decade, I feel confident in saying I'm very good at what I do. And yes, I help clients with various symptoms, but it's actually much bigger than just removing symptoms. These are struggles that these individuals are obsessed with and are defined by, and their problem becomes how they identify and they think about themselves. And my clients has often worked with multiple practitioners and are on the verge of giving up, and it really isn't uncommon for me to be the fourth or the fifth or the sixth person they've come to. And one of the aspects I like most about the work that I do is how positive the process is. People believe that they're going to have to give up so much, that it will be painful in so many ways, but they'll then convince themselves that it's better for their long-term health. But what I find is that the changes actually add to the quality of their life. They enjoy the changes and their new life. Their physical, their mental, their emotional health improves now, not in some far off distant time in the future. And after working together, my clients are able to regain what they thought was impossible. So having their periods again, conceiving, feeling energized and purposeful, and walking by a mirror without the dread of seeing their own reflection. I only have a handful of slots left and I'm nearing the end of taking on clients. I put out so much free material. The podcast is free, my blog posts are free, but if you want to work with me one-on-one, now is your chance to do so. If you're interested in finding out more, you can head over to www.7-health.com/help, so HELP, and there you can read about how I work with clients and apply for the initial chat.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Real Health Radio. Today it's a guest episode and something that was actually recorded back at the start of January. And my guest today is Laura Thomas, PhD. So Laura is a registered nutritionist specialising in intuitive eating, health at every size, and non-diet nutrition. She's based in London, where she's cutting through the nutrition BS and telling people what they really need to do or what they really need to know to stay at the top of their game. And I've probably been following Laura for the last year. It might be a little shorter than that. I first listened to her podcast when she interviewed Laura and Eve from Not Plant-Based, and then became a regular listener of her show. I also follow her on Instagram, and I enjoy the content that she puts out there, which is often using Instagram for long posts, so similar to blog posts, but doing it on Instagram. And what I really like about Laura is she has a strong science background. She's got a PhD, she's done postdoc work. So she's really great at looking at research and understanding research. But at the same time, she's very down to earth. She really wants the best for people. And she isn't afraid to call out food myths or diet nonsense. So as part of this episode, we chat about Laura's background, touching on her PhD and her postdoc work. And part of this work was around psychosocial behavioral change theory. So we cover what this is and what the research looked at. We cover her transition from being a researcher to becoming a practitioner and how she's found this change. We talk about the research around weight loss and the connection between weight and health and what we do know and what we don't know. And we also cover food addiction and what the research shows in this realm. So there's a lot that we cover as part of this one. And if you like this episode, then do check out Laura's podcast called Don't Salt My Game. It's definitely helped me to challenge some of my beliefs and has been an inspiration for certain guests that I've reached out to for this show. Laura really is doing good work in this world. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Laura Thomas, PhD. Hey Laura, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks for chatting with me today.
Hey Chris, thanks for having me on.
So to start off with, for those who are unfamiliar with who you are you able to give it a background on yourself? So the different training that you've done and also just what your day-to-day now looks like.
Yeah, sure. So I guess going way back, I did a degree in health sciences with a concentration in health and nutrition from the University of Aberdeen. And I did some undergraduate research at the Rowett Research Institute as part of my undergraduate degree. And that was around the gut microbiome and how the microbes that live in our intestines interact with our immune system and with the food that we eat, and just looking at how that can impact health.
Okay.
And so because I did a little bit of research as part of my undergrad, that led me on to doing a PhD. And I actually went to the States. I was at Texas A&M University, and I started out doing a lot of work on the gastrointestinal microbiome as part of my PhD. And my PhD was actually kind of split into two parts, which are completely unrelated to one another, but
okay.
That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
And so the first part was really looking at the microbiome, looking at a particular compound that comes from soybeans and seeing how that can modulate the immune system, or how the microbiome interacts with the immune system. And then the other part of my PhD was looking at psychosocial behavior change theory. So trying to understand why or what inputs affect a behavior. And the reason that we look at that, or why we try and understand that from a nutrition perspective, is so that we can influence behavior change related to nutrition and food and what people eat, and try and understand why people make particular food choices. And the other reason is because it helps us understand how to design a nutrition intervention aimed at making a particular behavior change. So if we don't understand what goes into making the behavior, then we can't really understand how to manipulate that behavior.
Sure.
So yeah, that was my PhD. And then I continued the work on behavior change in my postdoc. That was at Cornell University. And I was there for a couple of years. So really just doing research on the ground in the field, writing papers, publishing papers, that like super boring, but that's research and academia, right?
Yeah.
And then I came back to the UK and I decided that, I really love research. But the part of research that I really like is synthesizing all of the different parts of the puzzle and then applying that. So I set up my own practice, and here we are.
Okay, so there's actually a lot of that I want to unpack. So I guess, just going back, what made you want to study nutrition? Were you always interested in science and it kind of went from there, or was there some other way that you got into it?
Yeah, so I was like a huge science nerd in school. In Scotland, where I went to high school, you usually do one or two sciences, and I did all three sciences, so chemistry, physics, biology at higher level. And I remember my parents had to write a letter to the school to get them to let me do that, and it was just like this whole thing. But, within that, biology was always my really strong subject, like my strongest subject. And when I went to university, I actually started studying biotechnology.
Okay.
I thought that sounded really cool. But then I remember having a couple of lectures about somehow, it was connected to nutrition somehow. And then I just decided, actually, that's what I'm really interested in. And so, I started off on a completely different path, but after my first year, I switched and in the first year, you're just doing like general biology classes anyway.
Yeah.
So it was pretty easy for me to switch over. And then I just went the whole way.
And so what was food like growing up in your household? Like, did that influence you at all?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I think I had like a pretty complicated relationship with food as a kid, and it was never like a particularly happy relationship with food. But my mom was a really good cook, and she, I learned to cook from watching her. And I think almost anyone who gravitates towards nutrition, towards studying nutrition, has probably got some kind of a complicated relationship with food. And I was able to kind of figure that out through intuitive eating, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But yeah, I'd say that actually the process of studying nutrition, because of some of the things that you have to do as part of that curriculum, I'm sure you can probably relate to this, like keeping food records and tracking and, that kind of thing, like that. If you were predisposed to having a weird relationship with food, then that can really that can make things even messier and more complicated.
Yeah. And look, for me, I'm someone who very luckily hasn't had a complicated relationship with food. But I do remember studying, like, one week I wouldn't be having milk, and the next week I'd be cutting out all these foods. And you just go through this whole process as part of it. Because you read this book or you read that book, etc. And so I can imagine how much that then has an impact. And for nutrition, it is such a place that a lot of people who are troubled eaters or have complicated relationships with food often end up. So I can totally get that.
Yeah, and then when you're in it and studying it, kind of you all are almost competing with one another as well. Like there's this sort of unspoken thing of like, well, I'm studying nutrition, so I should have this all locked down. Yeah. But having spoken to colleagues in nutrition over the years, like that's not the reality for most people. Like a lot of people are really struggling, even though they're putting on the face of being the kind of quote unquote perfect eater.
Definitely. And I remember like thinking when I was studying that my lecturers must just eat perfectly and they've got it all figured out, and then you realize that is definitely not the case.
No, it's totally not the case.
And so with that complicated relationship with food, when did that start to improve?
I would say like it definitely... I haven't thought about this for a while. But yeah, I guess there are periods where it was better, and then other periods where it really struggled. So for example, like part of when I was going through my PhD, I was having a really tough time and ended up taking antidepressants. I don't know. Are we going this deep? I guess we're going this deep. And I just completely lost my appetite altogether and really didn't eat and lost a significant amount of weight. There was another point where I had a really rough breakup and also just didn't eat and really lost a significant amount of weight. And then, of course, there's the flip side of that, which is that you are then ravenously hungry and end up what feels like binging. Yeah. And so I think, where was I going with that? I think that getting out of that, so yeah, that relationship kind of like had its ups and downs. But then getting out of that was probably when I came across the concepts of health at every size, and intuitive eating. And I came across them like completely in passing, like in some blogs and things like that, and really didn't pay them that much attention. But kind of, I remember thinking like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Like, just sort of instinctively. I was like, yeah, people can be healthy at a variety of sizes, and I don't have to sort of be massively restricting the amount of food I eat or trying to conform to some body shape or body ideal that my body was just not designed to be in order to be healthy. And so that was like, as cliche as this sounds, it was kind of a light bulb moment for me. Yeah. And then, I kind of like that got buried in the back of my brain somewhere. And I kind of just went around practicing nutrition or kind of practicing my own flavor of intuitive eating, I would say, until I set up my own practice and realized that people were having really similar struggles to what I was having, at which point I kind of thought, wait, maybe there's something to this intuitive eating, health at every size thing. I really need to dig deeper here, get more training, get more, start talking to more people, start kind of really trying to understand this and putting this into practice. And that, I think, kind of, I don't want to say revolutionized my practice, but it really changed my practice, and it really changed my business. And, that's all I do now, pretty much.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a huge turning point for me.
Okay. And look, we're going to chat about intuitive eating because I think it's really important for what you do, and we definitely have a common interest there. But I just want to go back a little with your studies. So you went to Texas AMA University for your PhD. I mean, how was that as a transition from living in Scotland to moving over to the US?
So Texas is a special place. and it was actually a huge culture change for me. Having, you kind of assume that, well, it's a westernized country and, they speak the same language and it can't be that different. It's a completely different world in Texas. And, it's really interesting just kind of like from a social perspective, how even though you were a white Western person, they still kind of treated you like an alien sometimes.
Yeah.
So, it just kind of makes me think about people who look like they don't come from Texas, and how challenging that must be for people sort of emigrating to Texas. And I had a lot of friends in the international community, and I always wondered, wow, like if I'm struggling with this, then I can't begin to imagine how challenging that must be for you. Anyway, that's a kind of an aside to nutrition, but I think it was a huge culture shock, and especially because I am vegan and have been for a long time. Just navigating food in Texas became really tricky, and I really had to very quickly learn how to cook, which I didn't really know how to do before. Like I knew how to make macaroni and cheese and some of the things that my mom had taught me how to make, but she wasn't cooking vegan food. So I had to really educate myself on how to cook vegan food and do it well. So that was a challenge.
And was there a particular reason that you picked that university for doing your PhD? Kind of. I mean, the research that I was doing, they had a lab there who were doing similar research and were willing to take me on and train me. And as anyone who's done a PhD will know, like, you take what you can get, right? Like if someone's offering you the opportunity to do a PhD and to pay you to do the PhD as well, then you kind of take it. But we have family connections in Texas as well, so it kind of made sense from that perspective. So that's why I kind of focused the search in that area, I suppose. But yeah, it was kind of just like a series of events that led me to Texas. Okay. And
I wasn't like dying to live in Texas or anything.
Okay, sure. And do people have trouble with your accent?
People still have trouble with my accent. It's the most confusing accent. I think I sounded a bit more Scottish before I went to the States, and now I just have this weird hybrid accent. So I don't think it was so much the accent as just sort of intonation and the way that you phrase things sometimes like doesn't really make sense to Texans. So yeah, I think there was a little bit of a language barrier, but maybe not strictly just accent, just kind of phrases or the way that you would say things.
Yeah. So with part of the postdoc work that you did and also your PhD, you said there were two parts of it, and I'd like to focus on the second part, which was the psychosocial behavior change theory. So I know you kind of briefly talked about what that was, but can you talk about some of the research that you were doing around that and maybe anything interesting that came out as part of it?
Well, I don't know how interesting it was in terms of outcomes.
Okay.
But basically, it's been a really long time since I've thought about my PhD research, so I'm just trying to think about which parts are relevant. I think what was most important for me in terms of doing a PhD is that it teaches you a certain set of skills that you then apply to different research settings. So for example, like it's, I guess the research that I was doing was more just a vehicle for me to learn the different research methodology.
Sure.
So for example, I was looking at reasons why people might choose a local diet. So you might call it like a locavore or something like that. But the theory that I was using is something called the theory of planned behavior. And this model gets used across all different elements of healthcare and particularly nutrition. And it just helps us understand all the elements that dictate or determine a particular behavior. So I was doing that, and it's kind of complicated. I'm not sure how much you want to get into sort of research methodology, but basically what I did for my study was I did a pilot study where I talked to a group of people about their beliefs and their attitudes and the barriers to performing a particular behavior.
Okay.
And then I used that to develop a questionnaire. So it sounds like, oh yeah, sure, you just like write out some questions and you hand it out to people. That's not what survey research is at all. It's a very complicated thing, and there are a lot of statistics behind how a survey is presented and developed, and you have to do all kinds of validation studies and all sorts of things. So it's more complicated than it might sound.
Yeah.
And the other side of that is I was also doing dietary assessments. So something I was really interested in, and still am, is how do we assess the diets of populations. So dietary assessment methodology is very complicated. It's prone to all kinds of measurement errors. So, there are things like, well, if I ask you, what did you eat last week? Unless you've got that written down somewhere, you're going to have forgotten. So it's really tricky to be able to measure the diet of an individual, let alone a population. Yeah. So I was interested in looking at what are the best tools to help us get the most accurate representation of what a population are eating. And so I spent a lot of time looking at different tools and technologies, and ended up settling on what's called a 24-hour recall. But this is an automated 24-hour recall that you can do online, which is also subject to different measurement errors if you want to get into that. But that was kind of the best methodology for my study. And in fact, they actually use it to do population-based studies in the US. But yeah, if you're really nerdy about measurement error and dietary assessment, then that will be exciting to you. Otherwise, you're probably like, what the hell is she talking about? But yeah, basically what I wanted to do then with the two different parts of that study was look at behavior and intention to perform a particular behavior and how that corresponded with dietary intake. And so I was able to take the two parts of the study and kind of do some tricky stats and get an outcome. Can't really remember I've got published papers. I can link them to you if anyone's interested. But we were just looking to see if any of the behavioral predictor or behavioral components predicted dietary outcomes. Does that make sense?
It does. And I mean, I've done a couple of podcasts before on Cornell University's Food and Brand Lab. And I have no idea how big the university is, so this might be a stupid question, but did you do any work with that lab as part of that postdoc work?
Yeah, so the work that I was just talking about there was my PhD, but in my postdoc, the Food and Brand Lab were collaborators of my research groups. So yeah, we did a lot of work with them actually. They were just the next building over on campus. So yeah, I know those guys. Okay,
cool. Because I think they've done some very interesting stuff. And for anyone who's interested, I've done, as I said, a couple of podcasts, and it looks at how the environment affects food behaviors. So something like the music played in a restaurant or the level of lighting in a restaurant, how that can impact on the kind of food that someone orders or the amount of food someone eats, or how the size of a plate can impact on how people serve. And it's just really interesting to see how irrational human beings really are and how minor changes can really nudge them in different directions. So if people are interested in that, you can look up podcast 81 and 83. One's on how it impacts on children and one's on how it impacts on adults. But it just sounded like some of the stuff you were describing there in terms of people's planned intentions versus what actually happened was probably relevant somehow.
Yeah, it's what we call the behavior gap. So people might have really high intentions to perform a particular behavior. Let's say it's eating lots of fruits and vegetables, but then there might be some other barriers not really captured by the model that you're looking at, which could be explained by like a whole variety of reasons. And in fact, there's research dedicated to trying to figure out like, how do you bridge that gap between intention and behavior?
So when you finished up your studies, did you think about staying in the US?
Good question. I'm not even sure. I think it was like after 7 years, and I could have stayed on, and in fact my my postdoc supervisor wanted me to stay and do my own research. And I guess I kind of was just like at this point, one, where I didn't really know what I wanted to research. I knew that I didn't really want to keep doing the same line of research that I was doing in my postdoc, but I didn't know what I wanted to research. And I was also just kind of burned out, and I wanted to come home or be closer to home. Anyway, I'd spent 7 years in the States, so that felt like enough.
Yeah.
So I think it just sort of felt like the right time to come back. I could have stayed on actually, and kept doing the research that I was doing, or tried to get funding for my own research project. But I knew that I wasn't super, I don't think I'm cut out to be a researcher in the sense of like publish and perish and just, they work crazy long hours. Not that I don't do that now, but it's not my favorite environment. So I think I was pretty clear that I didn't want to do research. Teaching might be a different story, and I'm not ruling that out further down the line, but the publish or perish environment of academia isn't really my bag.
Okay. And so how did you then find that transition from doing that into working one-on-one with people and doing it in a clinical setting?
Yeah, it was definitely, it definitely took me a while to find my feet. And like I said, I was kind of in the beginning sort of using intuitive eating, but I was also really interested in plant-based nutrition. And I think in the beginning, that's the road that I thought I was going to go down. And it took me a little while just to find my feet and sort of realize, actually, I want to do this intuitive eating thing full time. And, I didn't know anything about running a business. I still don't really know anything about running a business. But, it took me a little while to kind of establish that. And that's part of, one of the reasons that I started my podcast was to help me connect with other people doing interesting work and to kind of connect with people who were maybe interested in hearing some of the things that I had to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how long have you now been practicing?
I think it's coming up for 3 years now. Yeah.
Okay.
In 2018. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, is there stuff that you think you've learned through practicing that you just wouldn't have discovered being a researcher?
Yeah, I think in research we can get really sort of I'm just trying to think how to articulate this. Like we can get a little dogmatic and sort of think, oh, this is the best way and everyone should sort of do this. And it doesn't always take into account people's individual experiences and their perspectives. And, I've realized like with my clients, especially in the context of intuitive eating, they are the expert, right? I'm just there to help them figure things out. I don't go in guns blazing. And this is probably slightly different from, just general nutrition. I'm not very prescriptive with what I do, and I don't give people meal plans or tell them to follow a certain amount of calories or count numbers or anything like that. So it's very much about tapping into what they already know, what has worked for them before, and really just like drawing that out of them, helping them connect the dots between different behaviors and how they're feeling, for example.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think I've talked about this before on other podcasts, but there is a disconnect between people who are just researchers and people who are actually practitioners, because when you deal with the real life human beings who are messy and have all of these confounding factors and it's complicated, you get to see that it's just not as straightforward as the research would often make it out to be. And that there really is an art to helping people with food stuff. It's not just these are the things that researchers showed us is the healthy foods and you should just get on and eat those things. And so, the researchers who I really like are also the people who are practitioners, because you then get the best of both worlds.
And that's not to minimize the importance of science and evidence-based practice. And I still draw on that. And I think it's really important, because otherwise we get the whole clean eating thing just happened because people just started making shit up about nutrition, right? And so, it's important for me to look into the evidence and look into the research, and again, not be dogmatic in my views, and learn and sort of keep abreast of the latest developments, but also be able to sort of make the connection between what the research is saying and how that applies to people in real life.
Yeah. Definitely. And it has to be context specific. And for every bit of research, you have people who are outliers, you have people who match up exactly with what the research shows, etc. So it's following that evidence-based stuff or evidence-based studies, etc. But also then looking at, well, how does this work in real life human beings when I'm dealing with them in practice?
Right. And there's some clinical experience and clinical expertise that has to kind of, that's part of evidence-based practice is, interpreting the science and then relating it to your clients' lives.
Yeah. And so as part of your training, did you have clinical hours, or is this just stuff that you've learned since all of that?
Yeah, so I actually, as part of my PhD, studied nutrition and dietetics. So there was a strong focus on things like motivational interviewing and, practicing talking to people. But I think my personality is I like talk to people anyway. So that's, but I have done a lot of trainings subsequently. I've done a lot of training with Lucy Aphramore, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but she's a big advocate of non-diet approaches. She pioneered something called Well Now. Yeah. And that, I think that gave me a really good grounding. Basically her approach is to just ask a shitload of questions to your client to help them, because it kind of relates back to what I was saying before, is they sort of have the answers. It's just probing them and challenging them, not not stressing them out, but just, gently challenging them to maybe show that they're, contradicting each other or contradicting themselves, or that they just to help them, again, connect the dots between what they want to do and what they need to do in order to affect a behavior change. I've done training like that. I've also done a lot of online training based in the US around intuitive eating and more sort of clinical skills and using clinical tools and things like that.
Okay. And I'd seen you listed Well Now on your website as further training you've done. And it's not something I'd come across before. I was looking into it, and it sounds really interesting. And so a lot of it is around just how you work with clients and behavior change and how you speak to them.
Yeah, so it depends on which element of the training that you're talking about. Lucy's work is very grounded in theory, but but yeah, she, the training that she gives is sort of more around how do you, what are tools that you can use? What are ways that you can talk to your clients to help, or how are ways that you can talk to your clients to help them her whole thing is kind of moving away from diets and towards, it's effectively intuitive eating, even though she doesn't call it that. We've had conversations about that. It's very similar. A lot of the components of Well Now are very similar to intuitive eating. And of course, Lucy wrote the book Body Respect with Linda Bacon, who's the author of Health at Every Size. So that's the kind of the perspective that she's coming from.
Okay. So I'd love to chat about sort of weight and your thoughts around weight, like based on what the research shows from your perspective, but also what you've experienced through clinical practice. And I know this can be a slightly radioactive topic and very polarizing, so I'll try my best to tread lightly. So I think there's two main points that I want to ask about. So the first is to do with like weight loss and whether we have research to show that we know how to induce weight loss that is actually sustainable over the long run. So if we were to follow up with people after 3 years or 5 years that they've actually been able to keep the weight off. So what is the stance in terms of research on that?
Yeah, so I think the best studies that we have available are meta-analyses that look at the rate at which someone can sustain weight loss over the long term. And I think it's a fairly well accepted fact at this point amongst just about whoever you speak to in nutrition, whether they're operating from a weight inclusive perspective like I am, or whether they're coming from a more traditional weight normative paradigm, meaning that their approach is to put people on a diet or some permutation thereof of a diet, even if they're not calling it that. And I think it's a fairly universally accepted that people will regain weight when you look 2, 3 to 5 years out. People will have regained the weight that they lost in that initial intervention, and potentially even have gained some more weight since then. We know that dieting is a risk factor for weight gain in the long term. And I don't think that any of my colleagues in nutritional sciences would really dispute that. The only sort of, I think the alternative view, or something that gets used as evidence for long-term weight control, is the National Weight Control Registry, which is based in the US. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. Yeah. And so in essence, what this is a database of people who have lost weight long term. And I forget the specifics in terms of like the time and the amount of weight and things that you have to in order to sort of qualify to go to have your name on this register. But basically it tracks that information along with the behaviors that you perform. And it all often gets cited as evidence that long-term weight loss is possible and it's achievable and da 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 da. However, the problems that I have with this database is that the types of behaviors that are required in order to maintain that weight loss are typically what we would consider to be disordered behaviors. So, I mean, you can read testimonials even on the website of people who appear on the weight loss register, and they're like fitness trainers now, or they're still meticulously tracking calories or macros or any other thing. So basically what I'm trying to say is that in order to maintain weight loss long term is for most people, they have to engage in a behavior that I would consider, and I know a lot of my colleagues working in this area would consider to be quite extreme behaviors or disordered behaviors. And then we sort of have to question whether or not that's healthy. If you have to maintain an extreme or a disordered behavior, to, be quote unquote healthy, is that really healthy?
Yeah.
So that's my criticism. I mean, there are more criticisms of it than that, but I think that's kind of sums up most people's thoughts on the weight control registry.
Okay. And do they have is there a guess as to what percentage of people are actually able to maintain that? Because I know there's the 95% of people won't succeed at their diet or regain the weight, and that's often the number that's bantered around. But is there other numbers or percentages that you would say based on the research?
Yeah, so actually I'm not really a huge fan of using that 95% failure rate statistic, because I think that it's slightly misleading in some ways. And so if I do use that statistic, I'll kind of caveat it. And actually, I'm not sure when the podcast is going out, but in March, I'm doing a whole webinar, an hour and a half worth of dissecting the literature. So everything from the weight control registry to, the stuff that this question that you asked me just now, for the EDRD Pro Symposium. So if people are interested in that, there's that talk plus a whole host of other great webinars and things on that. So I can send you the links for the show notes. I will put that in the show notes. And I'm pretty sure this is going to be out before March, but we'll see. Yeah, well, people, you can get the early bird registration or whatever. So, all of that was to say that I think it's important for people, I am 1000% a non-diet practitioner, and I think this is the most ethical way to practice. But I also recognize that there are shortcomings in the research and the literature around health at every size and the non-diet approach, and that we need loads more research. So one of the things that I'm quite critical of is this 95% failure rate thing, because actually I really dug into this. And that number was derived from a paper in the 50s, I believe, the 40s or 50s. So it's a really, really old statistic, and it kind of just gets thrown around as gospel. Yeah. And I think it's really important to be critical of that number. So what we do know based on, the actual picture isn't much better, but, what we know from more recent meta-analyses is that something like 80% of diets fail in the first year, and then the number goes up in the second year. And then if you look 4 or 5 years out, it's pretty unlikely that people have maintained that weight loss, unless of course they've gone on another diet. I would also caveat that with those studies in those meta-analyses are often really biased because of the researchers who have done them, because of things like publication bias. So we don't publish studies that don't show an effect, right? So how many studies are there showing that weight loss doesn't work, but they don't get published because they don't show an effect? Yeah. So that's publication bias, and that's true of all kinds of research. All research has, a publication bias built in. Most of it does. But then the other thing is something called an observation bias. So if you think about it, how many people who attempt to diet sort of in the wild also have a team of researchers, a team of dietitians, nutritionists, scientists, measuring them, giving them meal plans, weighing them, or checking in with them every week or however often it is in the study. Yeah. So there's an observation bias there. We also know that the types of people who sign up for weight loss studies are typically very motivated. They seek out those types of studies as well. So there's that. So we have to factor in all these different biases when we're talking about the research literature. So unfortunately it's not just a case of 95% of diets fail. Yeah. Probably it is quite close to that number in reality, but I think it's really important to state this is what the research shows. here are the problems with the research, and here are the holes in the research. So we can infer that actually the number probably is quite close to 95%, but, with these caveats.
Yeah. So the second part of this question then is to do with body weight or body fat and whether someone's weight has a direct impact on their health. So not through weight stigma, not through lower socioeconomics or other factors that can be correlated with being at, say, a higher weight, but the actual amount of weight that someone is carrying and whether this directly impacts their health. And this doesn't necessarily have to be about higher weight. It can also be about a lower weight, so problems with carrying too low amounts of weight or too low amounts of fat and having a direct impact.
Yeah, well, I think it depends, right? It really very much depends on which condition you're talking about and how you define health.
Okay.
And I think the problem is that so many, we've never done a study where we control every single variable apart from the amount of fat that a person has on their body, and done a randomized control trial where we control every element apart from the level of adiposity in an individual, and then said, okay, yes, this leads to this outcome. So I wouldn't be able to say with any degree of certainty, yes, fat causes this or body weight causes that. Do you see what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
I think we know absolutely, especially in the case of a clinical eating disorder, when somebody has a very, very low body weight, that has a clear impact on their health. But in terms of higher body weight, I think we just don't know because so many studies don't account for the variables that you suggest. Now, I think we know that some things are more challenging in the larger body. So you might have mobility issues, for example, and joint pain, for example. However, I don't think it's ethical practice to just outright suggest that person ought to lose weight, because we know there's an 80+% chance that person will then regain weight, which comes with its own sort of set of issues. I think we need to do better in terms of how do we help that person reduce joint pain, or how do we help them increase mobility without the knee-jerk reaction of you need to go on a diet. And that can look like all kinds of different things. And making some behavior change, let's say, in the case of a person who is in a higher body weight and is experiencing joint pain, that might result in weight loss. It might not. So I think it's really important to point out that just because you're coming from a non-diet perspective doesn't mean to say you're against weight loss per se, but you're against it being the sole focus of every intervention and the end goal of every intervention. The end goal is to help people improve health, no matter what weight they end up being at.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
No, it does. And look, part of the reason why I separated these two things out is I think they're important to look at differently. Because you can be in a situation where we discover that someone being at a higher weight, that higher weight does impact on their health. And the weight in of itself, not any of those other factors, the weight in of itself has an impact. But at the same time, we can also be admitting that we don't know how to actually change those things. So we don't know how to successfully bring someone down from that high weight to a lower weight and having them maintain that. But I think that needs to be thought about as separate. And the way I kind of conceptualize it or think of it is you can be from, an Afro-Caribbean background, or you can be sort of an Asian background, and it increases the rate at which or the percentage chance of having a certain disease. Just because we don't know how to change someone's ethnicity doesn't mean that we should say that thing is not true. Does that make sense?
Yes, but then you also wouldn't tell that person to change their ethnicity in order to treat the problem, right? You would say, okay, we know that this group of people are a higher risk of X, Y, and Z. how can we help them within the constraints that they have to be healthier, if that's something that they have access to, and that they, that's their prerogative. Because that's the other part that gets left out of health conversations, right? That it's everybody's obligation to be healthy. And we know that kind of an unfair expectation.
Sure.
Of people that everyone should be in the pursuit of health all the time, when we know that there are the main driver of health inequalities or health disparities is social injustice and social inequality. So yeah, that's where something that I feel gets really ignored, through a lot of public health advice, and it doesn't really address the systemic inequalities and injustices that lead to health disparities. Oh. So I think that kind of went off topic, but hopefully it's relevant.
No, look, and I totally agree. I just sometimes feel like when people say we don't know how to successfully get someone to be in a lower body weight, mm-hmm. it then gets looked at, well, we can't ever talk about weight possibly having an impact on someone's health.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess what I'm trying to say is having that as the focus of an intervention, especially at a public health level, I think it just creates more weight stigma, and it doesn't help. It affects people at both ends of the weight spectrum. If you are all across the weight spectrum, is if everything is focused on weight and not on behaviors. So I'm not saying that there's no link between weight and health. I just don't think, even if there is a link, because we can't do anything about it, doesn't it make more sense from a public health perspective to support health promoting behaviors independent of weight?
Yeah. And I totally agree with you. I just sometimes I fear that when we ignore, or when people are like, no, weight has absolutely no bearing on someone's health, mm-hmm. you lose a lot of people who could then get on board with the whole intuitive eating type of movement, because people are like, well, if you're believing that there's no link whatsoever, that anything else that you then say just gets disregarded. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think I do that. I'm not sure if there was someone specifically you had in mind who's doing that, but I think it would be really naive to. I think, well, there are two parts of it. I think it would be really naive to say that there's no relationship. I don't think with the science and the literature that we have currently that we know the extent of that relationship. And we also know that weight for the vast majority of people isn't a modifiable risk factor, at least in the long term, perhaps short term. But because of the quality of the science on, and, I wasn't sort of prepared to talk about all the different types of biases in the research literature. So I'm probably not doing it as much justice as I would like to, but I think with the level of bias that we have in the research literature, that it's difficult to parse those things apart.
Yeah.
And so from my perspective, and I know and others in this sort of doing this kind of work are reticent to make weight the focus of the conversation, just because we know that research is really heavily flawed, and it's not a modifiable risk factor. But we know through things like nutrition and sleep and exercise and smoking cessation and alcohol consumption that we can change people's quality of life and we can improve health.
Yeah.
And so from a public health perspective, that makes a lot more sense to me.
Sure. And so, look, a big part of what you also do in terms of your Instagram, in terms of your podcast, is like debunking myths around health and nutrition. And like, you spent many, many years studying while other people with very low qualifications or no qualifications are sprouting misinformation, but bringing or building up a very large following. So what advice would you have for lay public to assist with this stuff so they can, I don't know, avoid being duped?
Oh, you mean kind of like red flags to watch out for?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So something I'm pretty keen on is practicing food neutrality. So people get really confused when I say this. I don't mean that, all food is equivalent in terms of nutritional value, but sort of trying to bring loaded language out of the conversation around food. So instead of saying things like, this is a superfood, or this is junk food, or this is good food, or this is bad food, trying to talk about food, objectively. So this is a carrot, this is a vegetable, this is dessert, this is a cake, rather than having really loaded judgmental language around food. So if you're following people like that on social media, I would say get rid. Likewise, anyone who's promising you any sort of miracle cures or panaceas or promoting overly restrictive diet, or really any kind of restrictive diet, those are kinds of red flags for me. And anyone that's making big promises, and especially anyone that doesn't have any kind of legit qualification about nutrition, like thinking of fitness bloggers and stuff who are always constantly posting about nutrition. And I'm like, what are you talking about? You have no idea what you're talking about right now. Those would be the kinds of things that I would encourage people to look out for.
And if someone were to focus on just a handful of things to improve their health or nutrition, where would you say that they start, or what things do you think make the biggest impact?
It really depends. I mean, my focus is really working with people who have a troubled relationship with food. And so I always send people to read the book Intuitive Eating, which I think you're familiar with, by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, the 3rd edition, and tell them to, encourage them to start working on that relationship with food. If that's really difficult, just, by reading the book, then to work with an intuitive eating counselor or a non-diet nutritionist or dietitian. If it's someone who has a pretty good relationship with food, start thinking about, how different foods feel in your body. You don't have to go cutting loads and loads of things out of your diet in order to feel good. Maybe think about what you can add in. Can you get a little bit more fiber somewhere? What's going to help you have more energy? I think, people have a generally good idea of what constitutes a balanced diet, that they, you don't really need to spoon feed them. You can, and this is again, kind of something I learned from Lucy Avermore, is just how can we help them think a little bit more about how different foods feel in their body, because most people will know that if you just eat cake all day, every day, you're going to feel like shit. But most people also know if you have a balanced diet and you eat some fruits and vegetables and get some whole grains in, that you're probably going to be okay. So that's where I would start. Okay.
And look, the final thing I wanted to chat about was you wrote a really great article for the Huffington Post about sugar addiction, which I really enjoyed. So Are you able to just talk about the research around sugar addiction?
Yeah. So I guess sugar addiction is positioned in the media as kind of a fact, or food addiction in general is kind of portrayed as a fact. And I think a lot of people's experiences with food, especially the types of people that I'm working with, kind of matches that. Like, that seems like a good description for what they're experiencing, for their sort of embodied experience. And the solution that is presented a lot of times for overcoming food addiction is Well, can you guess what it is?
Avoidance.
Yeah. It's like basically elimination. It's cutting it out entirely. And the problem with this, at least as I see it, well, two things. One, when we actually break down the science and look at the literature, it doesn't actually support addiction in the sense of like a drug addiction, like cocaine or heroin, or, you know, a really serious drug addiction. But it can feel like that to people. So that's one thing, is the science doesn't really support it. And two, cutting sugar out entirely may actually cause more problems in the long run than it helps. And of course, you know, this is sort of just in general, like there are going to be exceptions to this as well. But essentially, if we look at the science, there isn't an enormous amount of evidence that supports the idea of food addiction. So the majority of studies that have been done on this concept are done in rats. And when we look really closely at those studies, we can see that there are a lot of problems. So one thing that commonly gets cited about food addiction is that food, and particularly high fat or sugar food or high salt food, it lights up pleasure centers in the brain.
Yeah. And
of course it does. Food is supposed to be pleasurable. Food is supposed to taste good. And so we're kind of over pathologizing a normal response to food. So, you know, like if you listen to your favorite song, or you are with your favorite person, or, you know, you're petting a kitten, like pleasure centers in your brain are going to light up. You know, that doesn't mean that you're addicted to kittens. So I think we have to be really careful when we interpret that literature. The other thing that, when you look very closely at the evidence for sugar addiction, is that the majority, or in those animals, they tend to have undergone a period of restriction for something like 12 hours on average before they're exposed to the sugary substance. And kind of a no-brainer to me that if you'd been forced to starve for 12 hours, that you would go really hard on the sugar because you're in an energy deficit and you want to get your blood sugar levels back up into that sort of safe zone. And so that gets taken as evidence that animals are addicted to those substances, when in fact that's probably a pretty normal response to starvation and deprivation. So, and then if we're looking at human studies, something that often gets cited as evidence for food addiction is the Yale Food Addiction Scale. I'm not sure if you've come across that, but basically it's a tool that was developed by Yale as both a sort of, what's the word? An assessment tool and a research tool. So yeah, it has a lot of problems, but one of the main criticisms is that it doesn't actually account for dieting or food deprivation in the model. And so what we know about dieting is that it can lead to disordered eating in the form of binge eating. And so what a lot of critics of the Yale Food Scale will have sort of suggested is that the Yale Food Addiction Scale isn't actually measuring food addiction. It's measuring a disordered relationship with food, or it's measuring the effects of dieting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So in short, there isn't a lot of good quality evidence to support the idea of food addiction, but it can, for a lot of people, feel, you know, a lot of people will experience symptoms that feel a lot like they're addicted to food. And so, you know, getting out of that hole is tough and challenging. And I would definitely recommend, well, I'm sure you'll link to that article that I wrote, but
yeah,
maybe working with someone who can help you understand a little bit more of what's going on and how to help you navigate that might be beneficial in that circumstance.
Yeah. So Laura, you've been very generous with your time today, and I know you need to get going. But before I wrap this up, can you tell people where they can go to find out more about you? So website, social media handles, podcasts, etc. And I'll be putting all of this in the show notes.
Okay, yeah. So my podcast is called Don't Salt My Game, and we're talking about everything from intuitive eating to body positivity to health at every size and some entrepreneurship and all kinds of things thrown in for good measure. And my handles across social media are just at Laura Thomas PhD, and my website's laurathomasphd.co.uk.
So Laura, thank you so much for coming on the show. So many of my guests are based in other parts of the world, so it's lovely to chat with someone who is in the same country and relatively close by.
Yeah.
And look, I really love the content that you're putting out and the approach that you're taking, so it was a real pleasure to be able to chat with you today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
So that is it for this week's episode. As I said at the top, if you are interested in working together, you can find out more by heading to www.7-health.com/help, where you can read more about how I work with clients and apply for the free initial chat.
Thanks for listening.